Boa tarde a todos. Meu nome é Thaís Tanos, eu sou assessora de sustentabilidade na Febraban e estarei hoje com vocês de novo, moderando o terceiro webinar da série sobre finanças sustentáveis, realizado pela Febraban e pela IFC, a International Finance Corporation. E aqui, em nome das duas instituições, eu gostaria de dar boas-vindas a todos nesse espaço de aprendizado e troca de experiências que a gente está tendo o prazer de sediar aqui, né, de trazer para todos nesse espaço virtual. A iniciativa desses webinars é fruto dessa parceria ampla entre a IFC e Febraban, com o intuito de promover e fortalecer o tema das finanças verdes no Brasil e contribuir para o alinhamento do setor bancário aos compromissos assumidos no âmbito do Acordo de Paris. Dentre as ações propostas do plano de ação desse trabalho, a gente, né, incluiu algumas capacitações, a elaboração de algumas pesquisas em conjunto e a realização de eventos como esse que a gente está aqui hoje. Evento que a gente elaborou a partir de a seleção de alguns temas com potencial de alto impacto no mercado brasileiro, que a gente conta com a ajuda de especialistas nacionais e internacionais para abordar aqui conosco nessas discussões. Então, por isso, né, o nosso tema de hoje é geração distribuída. Os nossos convidados vão fazer, então, uma introdução ao assunto, falar um pouquinho da oportunidade que ele representa para o Brasil e para as instituições financeiras do país. O evento vai trazer uma visão geral dessas tecnologias, né, de geração distribuída, principalmente falando da solar, quais são os impulsionadores do mercado e os modelos de negócio existentes, e uma breve noção de como esses elementos se apresentam no mercado brasileiro até agora e algumas perspectivas de futuro também. Queria, né, recepcionar e apresentar um pouquinho os nossos convidados de hoje, então. O Bill Gallery e o Patrick Doyle, que acho que já estão aparecendo aí na tela para vocês. O Bill é oficial de operações na equipe de finanças climáticas no grupo de instituições financeiras, o FIG, da IFC, que é focado em apoiar bancos e outras instituições financeiras nos setores de energia solar distribuída e off-grid. Ele gerencia os programas globais de suporte e assessoria para energia solar distribuída da FIG e apoia projetos de assessoria com instituições financeiras e clientes e aconselha equipes de investimentos da IFC no que tange a mercados e transações de energia solar distribuída. Ele é originalmente dos Estados Unidos e é bacharel em Ciências Ambientais e Políticas pela Universidade de Harvard e mestre em Políticas Internacionais pela Universidade de Stanford, com foco em energia, meio ambiente e recursos naturais. Seja bem-vindo, Bill. E o Patrick é oficial de investimentos sênior do grupo de instituições financeiras da IFC, com mais de 20 anos de experiência em energia limpa e mudanças climáticas. Nos últimos 10 anos, ele tem investido bastante na América Latina e possui especialização em geração distribuída, energia solar, eficiência energética e armazenamento. Ele possui um MBA pela The Wharton School e um mestrado pela Johns Hopkins e um bacharelado em engenharia pelo Washington State. Antes de passar a palavra para os nossos palestrantes, gostaria de só fazer algumas notas aqui para os participantes que estão nos assistindo. A gente vai ter um momento, né, de apresentação, depois uma sessão de perguntas e respostas após essas apresentações ao final. E a gente incentiva a participação de todos enviando a pergunta pela plataforma Numes da Febraban, que o endereço é numes.febraban.org.br. Então, para enviar a pergunta, você tem que estar logado, ou fazer, né, basta fazer um rápido cadastro, e envia a questão na caixa de comentários logo abaixo o vídeo da transmissão. Esse evento vai estar gravado depois, ao final da transmissão, na plataforma Numes, no canal do YouTube da Febraban, assim como os anteriores e os próximos que também vamos fazer. Então é isso, já vou deixar a palavra aqui para a gente já começar a falar sobre esse tema. Gostaria novamente de agradecer a presença do Bill e do Patrick aqui nesse evento, nessa tarde conosco. Muito obrigada. A fala dele será em inglês, traduzida para vocês em português. Obrigada novamente.
Thank you very much, Thais. I hope you can hear me okay. I want to say again, thank you to Thais. Thank you to Febraban for inviting us to participate in this webinar and for hosting this discussion of this important topic. And thank you to everyone who is listening in today. We hope we can share some useful information that helps you better understand this market and the opportunity that exists for financial institutions in it. I'm going to start just by giving the content of what we're planning on talking about today. I will start off by doing a brief introduction into what we talk about, or what we mean when we talk about distributed generation and why we're talking about it. I'll then give an overview of some of the business models that are present in the market, both in Brazil and globally. I'll then hand it off to Pat, who's going to give an overview of a more in-depth overview of the market, its size, the drivers, the different segments that are out there, with some specific information on the market in Brazil. And then he'll talk about what the specific opportunities are for financial institutions in this space. And then we'll close it out with a couple of case studies, and of course, plenty of time for you all to ask questions, additional questions that you might have. First, I wanted to talk about who we are and who IFC is. Many of you may know this, but for those who don't, IFC is the part of the World Bank Group that focuses on working with the private sector. I think we are probably the largest development institution in the world that has a private sector focus. We have a global footprint, and we work across sort of all parts of the investment and advisory value chain. So we offer debt, equity, trade finance, structured finance, and also various blended finance tools. On the advisory side, we we provide market research, market intelligence. We work with clients to help them develop new business models, new opportunities. We do capacity building. We have a very strong team that does capacity building in the environmental, social, and governance space, and then risk management as well as numerous other areas, including on distributed generation and distributed solar in particular. Pat and I, as Thais said, sit within the climate finance team in the financial institutions group. Our mandate is to help banks and other financial institutions do more investment in the climate space. And Pat and I specifically focus on the distributed generation and distributed solar sector. So both working with banks and other financial institutions to develop investments in projects, as well as providing advisory support on all the topics we're going to cover today. And obviously, we also have a very strong team within IFC in Brazil that we'd always be happy to connect people to if they have further questions. So let me get into the content of the presentation. First, what is distributed generation? So at a very high level, it's electricity produced on site, generally co-located with the demand, with the consumer, which can be produced from a wide variety of technologies. And so we have some pictures of the main ones here: solar, biogas, biomass, cogeneration from gas plants. There's really a wide range of technologies, also microhydro, that can qualify as distributed generation. Today, we're mostly going to talk about distributed solar, which makes up over 99% of the distributed generation projects in Brazil, and really a very large majority of the distributed generation projects globally. So what is distributed solar? It's basically the same thing. It's a solar system installed directly at a residential, commercial, or industrial site, primarily for consumption on site, although there are some exceptions to that, which we'll talk about a little bit more below. In Brazil, the community solar setup, as well as the remote generation program in Brazil. It can be ground mounted or rooftop mounted. It can be connected to the grid or off grid, and it can come with or without battery storage. So really, it can be a wide range of different setups within that broader distributed solar category. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of those in a bit. And sort of the most fundamental point is that it's a growing opportunity to engage with clients in what is a really rapidly growing market. So distributed solar can be a range of different types of projects, a range of different setups. It's a very rapidly growing market, and that's why we're talking about it today. I'm going to give a very basic overview of the technology. For many people on the call, they may already know some of this, but I just want to make sure that everyone is already or has the same basic understanding of what the technology is and what the different parts of the solar system are. So the first and most important part of this is having a PV panel, a photovoltaic panel that transforms sunlight into DC current, or direct current electricity. Then within the system, the inverter transforms that DC current into AC current. This is important because the vast majority of machinery and equipment and appliances runs on AC current. Pretty much everything you have in your house, you have at your office, requires AC current to operate. Any excess power, any surplus power can be exported to the grid if the local regulatory rules allow that. And in Brazil, they generally do. However, in most cases, the solar panels are not going to provide enough power to meet the entire demand on site. So for example, if we're talking about a cloudy day or at night, right, when you're using equipment at night, so the grid or a backup diesel generator will generally provide the rest. Increasingly, you can have battery storage set up along with the solar system that you can charge when the demand on the power demand is low and the solar panels are producing energy. And then when the solar panels aren't producing energy, you can discharge that battery to run your equipment or your appliances or whatever you need. So that's just the basics of what a solar system is. Talking a little bit about the basics of the distributed solar market. And in our mind, we tend to divide it into three different segments or three different markets. The first one of those is the off-grid market. This is relatively uncommon in Brazil, although there certainly are people in this segment. This is for clients who don't have access to the electrical grid and are often using expensive kerosene or diesel generators for their sources of electricity. As I said, it's relatively rare in Brazil, though there is a Brazilian program called Luz para Todos, which is focused on this market segment. The second one here is what we call the bad grid market. This is for people with unreliable grid service, where there are lots of power outages or the quality of the power coming from the grid is not very good, which leaves them dependent on diesel generators to fill some, most, or even almost all of their electricity needs. Again, in Brazil, relatively uncommon, though still somewhat common, or still there are segments of the market where this exists. And the third one is the expensive grid market. And this is really the bulk of the Brazilian market. This is where the regulatory environment and the economics of both power from the grid and of distributed solar mean that distributed solar can compete with power coming from the grid, power coming from the utility. And finally, in the introduction, why are we talking about distributed solar? So first point is that this is a reliable and proven technology, as long as you have the right quality assurance. I think probably many of us have heard stories or have seen experiences with poor quality solar installed at locations. Just actually last month, my neighbor across the street, one of the panels on his roof caught on fire. And this has maybe created the perception in many people's minds that solar is not a reliable technology or it's a dangerous technology. And that is increasingly not the case. I mean, at this point, it is a proven technology deployed in hundreds of thousands or millions of sites across the world. And with the right quality assurance framework in place, it's reliable and increasingly a bankable technology. Second point, solar costs have fallen rapidly. They're already cheaper than the grid in many markets, especially given regulatory support like you have in the Brazilian market. And solar plus battery storage is following an even faster fall, an even faster cost curve. You can see in this chart on the right, this is just updated from the end of last year, showing the weighted average cost of a solar installation globally. And you can see that it's been falling. It was falling fairly rapidly up until the beginning of COVID. You'll see a slight peak in 2021 due to a lot of the supply chain constraints that we all know about that have been caused by the COVID crisis, but should begin to fall again towards the end of this year or early next year as the supply chain bottlenecks ease and new supply of some of the critical components that go into solar PV comes online. These are weighted averages, by the way. Brazil in 2021 is basically right in the middle of the range you see there. I think it's about 86 US cents for a commercial installation, 86 US cents per watt for a commercial installation. So in the middle or even towards the low end of the costs that we see globally. Third point here is that the costs are predictable. And by that, I don't mean that they're predictable. The prices that we see in this chart are predictable going into the future, though generally they have fallen for a long time and we expect them to continue to fall after this sort of COVID bump. What I mean is that the vast majority of the cost of a solar system comes up front. The ongoing operations and maintenance costs are relatively low and pretty predictable. So when you install a solar system at a location, you have a very good sense of what your electricity is going to cost for the next 10, 15, 20 years, depending obviously on the terms of the financing and all that. But it's to say that unlike, say, a fossil fuel technology where the prices of the fuels can fluctuate a lot depending on the global markets, once you've installed the system, you should have a pretty clear sense of what your costs are going to be, which is a huge advantage of the technology that probably doesn't get talked about enough. And all this means that this is an increasingly bankable alternative to grid power, with the potential to eliminate the need for backup generators and to help people reduce their reliance on the electrical grid. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the different business models that are out there to enable the uptake of distributed solar in the market. Apologies for this slide that we were not able to translate this image, but I'll talk through it now, and obviously you'll have access to the presentation later and to the recording later. This slide is focused, so Brazil's regulatory framework allows for a pretty wide range of business models in the distributed solar space. In this slide, we'll focus on that topic from sort of the consumer standpoint, and the next slide we'll talk about from the financing and ownership standpoint. But in terms of who is consuming the power provided by the distributed solar system, Brazil's regulatory framework has a number of options in place. The first one here, which is probably the vast majority of cases and the most straightforward, is just on-site generation. You put a solar system up and the business or the people at the same location are the ones consuming it. The second point here is remote consumption. Similar setup, except the solar panel and the consuming, or the load, the demand, do not have to be in the exact same place. So if it's the same owner within the same concession area, they can have the solar panels at one site and they're consuming the energy at another site. The third and fourth options here, neighborhood solar and community solar, are a bit more complex. They generally involve multiple users, either co-located with the solar panel with the solar system, or not co-located, but just within the same sort of general utility area. And we can talk more about these specific business models if you want, or these specific setups if anyone has any questions, though they are relatively rare. On this slide, I'm talking about the different business models that are out there more from the financing and ownership standpoint. And so, as I mentioned before, most of the cost of a solar system is upfront. And due to that high upfront cost, there are a number of business models out there made to address the consumer financing needs or the customer financing needs. So that's loans, rental contracts, leasing, long-term power purchase agreements. Generally, we've broken these down, or generally these are broken down into two broad models. First, on the left is the CapEx model. The second on the left is the OpEx model, or the DESCO model. DESCO standing for distributed energy service companies, or DESCOs, sometimes called RESCOs in some markets. For the CapEx model, this is kind of just any typical equipment purchase model. Either the customer is going to pay for it upfront in cash, or they're going to finance it through a loan or a financial lease. And the main feature of this is that the consumer is the owner of the system. They're making a capital investment in the solar system. They're responsible for the ongoing O&M and just general maintenance of the system. The benefits to them, one is that this can be cheaper depending on the financing terms you can get. And obviously you're the owner of the asset, which depending on the country or depending on the regulatory environment can have tax benefits. The challenges to this are obviously securing the cash or the financing you need to install it in the first place. And it puts greater responsibility on the consumer in terms of selecting the EPC, the construction company, the solar company they're going to work with, and managing the ongoing operations and maintenance. The OpEx DESCO model, which is increasingly common in pretty much every market in the world where it's allowed anyway. In this model, the ownership is flipped, and ownership stays with the DESCO or the distributed solar energy company that's installing it in the first place. The cost to the customer, in these models, the customer is paying on an ongoing basis, either through a power purchase agreement where they're paying the distributed solar company per unit of power that they're using from the system, or through some sort of rental or leasing arrangement where they're paying more or less a fixed fee per month over the life of the financing. This brings a lot of benefits, obviously, to the customer: much smaller upfront investment, immediate monthly savings on their electricity bill, which is a huge selling point, and one of the reasons this is an increasingly popular model. Predictable long-term costs, and you have this solar company in place that's responsible for all the ongoing operations and maintenance. The main challenge here is picking the DESCO to work with, making sure you have a reliable partner that's going to be around for the life of the contract, which could be anywhere from 10 to 15 years. I'm going to talk briefly about one business model that is not common in Brazil, but I think is an interesting one, especially in markets in sub-Saharan Africa and some places in Asia, and increasingly has applications in Latin America as well. This is called the pay-as-you-go model. It's generally used for financing small-scale off-grid solar systems. And basically what it involves is a small solar system installed with a small deposit on the roof of a customer. And then the customer is prepaying via cash or mobile money for the power they're going to use. They receive in exchange a code via SMS or a scratch card. They then enter that code in the system, and the system turns on for some period of time, sort of like mobile phone credits. Once the prepaid money has expired, the system shuts off, and the customer doesn't have use of the system until they pay again. And this has been an increasingly common way of financing smaller scale off-grid solar systems, as I said, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, generally financed by the distributor itself over a period of 12 to 36 months, and increasingly leading to opportunities for large-scale off-balance sheet financing via SPVs, with the receivables from the customers underpinning the debt provided to these SPVs. And the reason I want to mention it here is it's just an interesting model that we're seeing out there in the world, but also, as I said, we're seeing it not just for distributed solar, but for a range of other applications as well. So companies are increasingly offering this kind of financing for cooking fuel, for appliances, for mobile phones, even for motorbikes and taxis. And so I think there's business models emerging, not just in Africa, but also in Latin America, using the same kind of pay-as-you-go approach that we may be seeing emerging in the next few years. And finally, my last slide before I'll hand it off to Pat, talking about some of the risks that are out there and what the mitigants are for distributed solar in general and for these particular business models. And generally, we divide these into two broad categories, one being off-taker risk, the other performance risk. Off-taker risk being the likelihood that the end user is actually going to pay you back and be able to make all the payments on their contracts. This is obviously something that banks and financial institutions are very familiar with, and something you would be well placed to deal with as you're getting into this market segment. Performance risk, however, is when we talk about performance risk, we're talking about the quality and reliability of the technical solution. So the technology itself, the technical side of the business. And because these systems, that distributed solar systems generally last quite a bit of time, like I said, I think anywhere from 10, 15, 20 years or more. And because many of the financing contracts that are out there are also lasting a substantial amount of time, there needs to be some quality control around the technology and around the technical aspects of the system to make sure that it's going to continue to operate reliably, and in turn that the customer is going to continue to want to pay for it. So ensuring quality control is a very important part of this business model. It's one of the sort of very important mitigant that makes it a viable business model for DESCOs and for financial institutions. And we at IFC have been working on developing and soon to be piloting a quality assurance framework that can help banks and others do this. And we'd be happy to talk more about that, obviously, if anyone has any questions on it. But the idea being to help banks and other financial institutions mitigate some of this performance risk and make them more confident in financing these types of projects over the long term. Okay, and that is it for my section. I'm now going to hand it off to Pat, who is going to, as I said, provide an overview of the market and talk a little bit more about the opportunity for financial institutions. Pat?
Thank you, Bill. I'm excited to be here. And I've worked quite a bit on the Brazilian distributed generation market. So we'll talk a little bit about that market in particular, and then we'll try to finish up within 20 minutes or so. So there's plenty of time for questions. On the first slide, we're looking at the market size and the global market size. Solar, in its essence, is the source of all our planet's energy. And as humankind, we're finally getting around to harnessing that, and in the future, it will be the primary source of our energy. I don't think there's much doubt about that. Distributed solar, in particular, which we're talking about, will likely be a large piece of that solar portfolio of energy. As you can see, in the last in the next 5 years, it's predicted to be about half of that. Over the long run, whether it's distributed or large utility scale plants, will depend a lot on how our grid develops and also on battery storage and battery storage technology. You can see in the right these two small charts where Brazil is one of the largest markets for distributed generation at both the residential as well as the commercial level. Also, I wanted to give you a sense of what a gigawatt is, because a lot of the numbers we talk about, and so the Itaipu Dam in southern Brazil is 14 gigawatts. I believe it's one of the largest in the world, if not the largest. So you can see the numbers we're talking about. 300 gigawatts are significant even in comparison to a hydropower project. I think we talked a little bit, Bill covered this topic a little bit, the market drivers and how the upfront cost of finance is really the barrier to renewables versus traditional fossil fuels because of the high upfront cost but low long-term operating costs. So obviously financial institutions need to play a key role in their expansion, and they have. The cost reductions are a big driver, as Bill mentioned, and hopefully that continues. Battery technologies also have been on a rapid decline. And the combination of solar with battery will likely make distributed solar the most economical source of energy at some point in the near future. Regulatory support is key, and that's really what's driven Brazil's market, along with electricity prices. And then the early drivers of distributed solar often were corporations that wanted to purchase solar, produce their own energy, and there's many examples of that. We have some pictures later of L'Oreal, for example, and their efforts both to put as much solar as possible on their roof. L'Oreal in Brazil put as much solar as possible on their roof, but also using the legislation in Brazil to purchase energy offsite to maximize the amount of solar energy that they're purchasing. Go to the next slide. These are examples of the markets, of just sample markets that the Ifc works in. Ghana and Nigeria in Africa, two different examples, because in Ghana, it's really higher electricity prices. You have a grid that's reliable, but you're competing with the grid. Whereas in Nigeria, you're competing with small diesel generators, and it's more the off-grid, or what we call bad grid, where people rely on their own generation because the grid is not reliable enough. And then Brazil, of course, as I mentioned, with high electricity prices and very strong regulatory support, is the driver for why it is a global leader in distributed generation. You can go to the next one. This is just giving you examples of different segments of the distributed generation market, and banks obviously have to tailor their products to each segment. Going from the small residential, which is a 10 watt to a 1 watt to 10 kilowatt scale, and then in the various sizes of commercial installations. And then you have the aggregators segment as well, which is at the larger corporates that are purchasing solar, sometimes from utility scale, but in Brazil, the Geração Remota, the remote generation framework. We tried to put a few examples of Brazilian clients that are in this segment at the bottom here. You can go to the next one. As mentioned, Brazil's market has been growing rapidly. It exceeded 3 gigawatts last year, so that's a big hydropower project. And you can see the J curve, as they call it, shooting up, and it will continue to do that this year and next year for sure, and probably slow down a little bit with the new regulations that have been passed, but we don't anticipate that it will significantly stop the growth. If you look at the number of installations, it's largely residential, but because they're small, if you look at the amount of dollars invested or the total capacity, it's about 40% residential, about 40% commercial, and then about 20% offsite remote generation, as mentioned. And that segment is expected to continue to grow fast. Go to the next one. It's been very diverse, the development of the distributed generation market in Brazil. Unfortunately, the colors on these slides don't match. They're from two different sources. So, but you can see on the left that it has been a diverse development of the projects, and that the primary markets are in Minas Gerais is the largest market, and that's because of some particular state incentives in the taxes that the state allows to be generated or used as credits for the projects, but also the large population states, São Paulo and Rio Grande do Sul. You can go to the next slide. Okay, this is a very hot topic in Brazil and has been for years. But now, just a few weeks ago, the new law was actually signed by the president. This is more a slide for you to read later, but I'll try to hit a few of the points without going too in detail, and we can answer some questions. And I believe we can always do a follow-up presentation as well. We have some good reports on this and some expert lawyers and consultants in Brazil that know these regulations and can help with the risk assessment with any of your particular projects or borrowers that you're looking at. But as I mentioned, it is one of the most generous and most supportive laws for distributed generation in the world. And it allows distributed generation to be up to 5 megawatts. Now that's changing to 3 megawatts, but 3 megawatts is still a very large distributed generation project. It does give you basically full net metering credit. So it gives you credit as if the panel was on your roof and you're not consuming from the grid, you're consuming from the solar produced on your roof. And in some states, it also exempts you from the tax, the ICMS tax. And that's what I was mentioning with Minas in particular being a large source of projects because it's a significant portion of the cost. And then as you produce excess credits, you can keep them for up to 5 years. So that's a very beneficial technology. You don't have to use them within the same month or 6 months or year as in many other regimes. So basically you use the grid as a bank or as a battery. You put your credits into the grid and you get to use them whenever you like, and you don't pay any additional fee for that battery or that bank as the grid. Now the new reforms that were just passed and signed on January 7th will change this somewhat, but there is a portion, but all projects that receive their transmission access or parceria throughout this year, so until the end of 2022, will be grandfathered. So they'll have the same regime for the next until 2045. So almost 23 years from now, they'll still be under the old regime or the current regime. So all those projects you don't have to worry about regulatory risk for. Now post this year, so in 2023, and during 2023, there's a 12 to 18 month difference in the legislation, but you can just safe to assume in projects that are built in 2023 will have some changes. Basically, the legislation is designed to more harmonize with what's fair, you could say, but that distributed generation consumers, rather than receive all of the credit for any energy you inject into the grid, you receive a portion of the credit that's associated with generation, but you still have to pay for the cost of the grid. And this regulation was negotiated over a long period of time, but it was an agreement reached between the utilities, the distribution generation companies, and the Distributed Generation Association, Solar Association of Brazil, and of course the utilities, which were the primary drivers for this, and ANEEL. So it will reduce the value of that energy you inject into the grid by somewhere between 20 and 40%. But it will also reduce some of the costs that remote generation faces now. So it's location dependent. But as we said, the market will still be strong post this reform. And it is definitely a sector that we expect to continue to grow in Brazil. There also will be, last bullet is really that you have to pay for your transmission access permits, which will kind of discourage companies from signing up and aggregating many access permits that they never plan to use, that they plan to just resell. So there'll be a significant fee associated with obtaining an access permit And also you will have to actually build the plant within 12 months. Now that only applies to projects in 2023 and beyond. You can go to the next slide. So the investment opportunities, and we wanted to talk about the investment opportunities for financial institutions, obviously. We did talk about the barriers being long-term finance, and you obviously can look at two segments here. You can look at lending to the developers or the DG companies, or the aggregators of many small projects. And that can either be on their balance sheet, or it can be in an SPV or a FIDIC structure, or it can be lending to the end consumers. So there are different markets and different products and different risks involved in each of those. And the IFC can help, as we'll talk about a little bit, but with advisory services, as well as with all of the various financial products that we can offer to banks and financial institutions to support them with this market: debt, sub-debt, equity, and risk-sharing facilities or guarantees. Go to the next slide. Our advisory services in particular can help with market research to help you understand the potential opportunity. As Bill mentioned, quality assurance to help you assess the technical risk of the projects. Pipeline development to help you identify potential clients. And then credit risk management to help you understand the unique risks that might be involved with distributed generation. And this really depends on the type of contract and who bears the risk, whether it's the end user or the O&M contractor or the distributed generation company or the aggregator. So the projects are not, the risks are not unique for financial institutions, but the way that the risks are shared amongst different parts of the solar project, or different parties that are involved in the solar project, is what really makes it a unique market and a place where IFC would be happy to help you assess. You can go to the next slide. Here's a few quick case studies. The first one is a bank in Namibia where we financed, help them issue a green bond that they use to finance distributed generation solar projects. You can go to the next slide. And this is a case of using advisory services to help a bank in Yemen develop a solar lending program, building their capacity, helping them establish a dedicated team, and then piloting specific products. You can go to the next slide. And then this is Sol Fácil. You may know of them, one of the leading fintechs in Brazil, where the IFC made an equity investment last year. They provide residential homeowners loans for solar rooftop projects. So different from the Geração Remota projects. And they also raised about 1.3 billion in debt via a green bond or a green FIDIC last year. You can go to the next slide. That's the end of our presentation, but we're very happy to be here and appreciate your time today. And if you'd like, we can answer questions. Obrigado.
Obrigada, Patrick. Obrigada, Bill. Foram ótimas apresentações sobre o tema. Esperamos que também tenham sido excelentes oportunidades para os participantes, e ouvintes aqui do webinar, para ampliarem o entendimento da geração distribuída e a razão que ela tem se consolidado como uma oportunidade para o mercado brasileiro, para os bancos e outras instituições financeiras também. Eu acompanho um pouco o tema desde 2011 e tenho visto realmente essa evolução do mercado no setor financeiro, especificamente em Minas Gerais, que o Patrick mencionou, ser um dos estados, né, que tem se destacado aí. Eu sou de lá e realmente é bem legal ver essa evolução assim na sua frente, né, nos seus olhos. E é isso, né, é um setor muito estratégico, porque o país tem já acessado alguns recursos verdes que a gente entende que tem um potencial grande para o desenvolvimento também, pensando na redução de gás de efeito estufa, na adaptação do grid energético do país, pensando nessa transição climática também. Antes da gente entrar na sessão de perguntas, eu aproveito o momento também para anunciar que a gente vai ter um segundo webinar sobre esse tema, que a gente ainda está organizando, ainda estamos fechando a questão de datas e divulgação. E aí vai estar um pouquinho mais focado nos atores nacionais do sistema de geração distribuída no país. Então, né, peço aí para os participantes ficarem atentos aos canais oficiais e redes sociais, tanto da Febraban quanto da Ifc, que as novas datas dos próximos webinars dessa série que a gente está divulgando serão anunciados em breve e também vão abranger outras discussões temáticas e setoriais. Para esse debate, a gente trouxe algumas perguntas que a gente recebeu da plataforma Numes. Ainda dá tempo, caso algum participante ainda também queira enviar algum questionamento, basta fazer o login ou um cadastro rápido lá na plataforma da Numes e mandar a questão pela caixa de mensagens abaixo do vídeo da transmissão. Então, para começar, né, para a gente começar a aquecer aqui as nossas perguntas, acho que um dos pontos interessantes que o Bill mencionou mais no começo foi a questão do programa brasileiro, né, do Luz para Todos, por exemplo, mas principalmente a premissa da inclusão social no acesso, né, à energia, que é um ponto também interessante para a gente pensar numa transição energética justa, né. No Brasil, recentemente a gente teve o exemplo do Banco BV, antigo Banco Votorantim, que ofereceu financiamento de mais de 1.000 painéis solares para uma comunidade de mais de 240 casas, em parceria com uma ONG, a Gerando Falcões, numa comunidade do estado de São Paulo, que eu acho que é um exemplo importante de modelos que podem ser pensados e replicados, né, no setor financeiro. E isso me faz pensar também um pouco como os bancos e o setor pode gerar outras oportunidades que sejam inclusivas e outros modelos que também possam ser replicáveis para a expansão da geração distribuída, né, de acordo também com outros exemplos que vocês trouxeram e observam da sua experiência internacional. E aí, entrando um pouquinho em algumas perguntas, né, então, vocês poderiam citar, então, 1 ou 2 mecanismos que vocês entendem que os bancos podem utilizar para identificar algumas dessas oportunidades, né, como eu citei nessa introdução, de financiamento solar, por exemplo, entre sua carteira de clientes. E vocês fiquem à vontade de se organizar na ordem das respostas.
Yes, Bill, feel free to contribute. But I believe the question is focused on amongst your existing clients, how could you identify which ones have the opportunity to install solar? And I think there's, I mean, the IFC does have a strong advisory services program and has worked with financial institutions for decades on this type of challenge. And we, Bill could talk a little bit more, but that's definitely something we can work with a bank to look at their existing client list. And then if we understand some of the information about their clients' use of energy, their demand for energy, their cost of energy, determine whether there's an opportunity to do more lending to this particular client for clean technologies in general, not just solar. But in Brazil, it's safe to say that that the prices of electricity are high enough and that the regulation is strong enough that if the client has a large facility, it's highly likely that they could cost effectively install it on their roof. And if they don't, it's likely that they could participate in a remote generation scheme that would provide them solar energy for the same or for savings. It does depend quite a bit on the state and the utility that you have in Brazil for how quickly the payback will be. But for a client that's willing to make it a priority and use its balance sheet to borrow direct to implement these measures, it can be very competitive and compelling in Brazil.
Yeah, I wanted to add a couple points here. First would be just to echo what Pat said, which is in Brazil, the economics are getting good enough that I think if you offer a product in this space, your clients will figure it out for themselves and will come to you with interest in the product because it's becoming so widespread. The other 2 points I wanted to make, though, first is this is somewhat of an emerging opportunity or emerging thing that's happening, but there's increasingly use of technology, basically satellite technology, satellite imagery, and automated, let's say, automatic algorithms or AI to assess the potential for solar on rooftops. So our colleagues at the World Bank have been doing a lot of work in this space where they take satellite imagery, they run an analysis on it, say for a city like Sao Paulo, they run an analysis on it, and then they're able to identify, first of all, the total potential for rooftop solar in that city, but also on a given building, what's the potential? And so this is an emerging area, but if it sounds of interest, be happy to talk about it more and see if there's ways to work together on that. But again, just given the economics in Brazil, you might not even need that. I think if you develop a product and offer it to your clients, you'll find that there's a lot of interest and a lot of opportunity there. And the second point I wanted to make is I think something we've seen in other markets, and actually in Brazil as well, is financial institutions partnering directly with solar companies, sort of established solar companies with good reputations, especially on the quality side, and working with them to help identify a pipeline of projects. So if you can identify solar companies you're comfortable working with, they are the experts in developing projects and identifying opportunities, and you sort of lean on their expertise in that area while they're leaning on your expertise in providing financing. And those partnerships have been fruitful in other markets.
Legal, Bill. Essa é uma pergunta também que a gente tem aqui, né, que ainda há um pouco de falta de informação, né, de entendimento, talvez, do mercado, das tecnologias, né, e como que é possível quebrar essa barreira de informação. Você mencionou, né, essas parcerias, né, desse trabalho em conjunto, né, talvez capacitação também é um caminho que possa ser trilhado, mas teria alguma experiência, algum detalhe, né, que você possa citar, talvez, de outros países em que foi possível quebrar essa barreira da informação para fazer um produto mais atrativo para esse público?
Yeah, I'm happy to take this first, Pat. And this is something IFC actually has a ton of experience with in the off-grid solar market segment. We have a program called Lighting Global, which for the past decade or so has been working in off-grid solar to build that market sort of across the entire value chain, but with a particular focus on quality assurance and consumer education. And I think that's been a really good example and learning experience for us on how you can design and execute consumer education campaigns to spread information about solar technology, about the reliability of solar technology, about the companies that are out there in the market that customers can go to. And one important lesson we have learned from that is, a decade ago, 2022, so more than a decade ago, when solar was really first emerging as a distributed technology, as an off-grid technology, there was much more need for this. People, especially in some of the more poorer markets or some of the more remote markets, didn't even understand the basics of the technology and would ask very simple questions like, if I put a solar panel on my roof, will it use up the sun and will the sun go away? And like very, very basic questions. Now, solar technology is pretty much everywhere in the world. Almost any consumer you talk to will know, will have a basic understanding of the technology. And the challenge is more about explaining the nuances, building confidence in the reliability of the technology, building confidence in the solar companies you're working with. So the need for sort of really basic consumer education is much less. And the type of education you need to do is maybe more targeted, a little bit more like marketing and a little bit less like education as people become more and more familiar with the technology. So I think this is something we've managed to do quite successfully in certain countries in the off-grid sector. There's lessons from that can be applied to the distributed sector, but also just in general, the solar is evolving rapidly. People are getting information just organically through word of mouth. And that's also something we can use to our advantage.
Ótimo, obrigada, Bill. Uma outra pergunta que nós temos aqui é também sobre de que maneira que os bancos podem estimular projetos de geração distribuída solar sem desviar do core da atuação como uma instituição de crédito, né, comprometida com o retorno e a gestão de riscos da sua operação.
Sure, I can start that. I think that this is not a higher risk sector when you understand the full details of who your borrower is and what the contracts are that are involved for the generation of that solar energy. If you're lending to a SPV and you're basing it on the receivables, it's much like another receivable contract. In Brazil, these remote generation projects can be lower risk than rooftop in some ways, because if a client defaults, you can replace them. But the evidence in other markets of rooftop solar is that the default rates have been extremely low. The risk of the penalty for a client defaulting on a solar project is often they're going to pay much more for their electricity. So it can be a low risk segment to lend to, actually, or a lower risk type of project to lend to. And it doesn't require necessarily any lower interest rate from the financial institution to make the economics work.
Ótimo, Patrick. A gente falou um pouquinho, né, da questão de riscos agora, mas eu acho que também, relacionando com uma outra pergunta que a gente tem aqui, se você puder falar um pouquinho sobre se é necessário um novo produto, um novo modelo também de financiamento para projetos de geração distribuída, ou os bancos também podem aproveitar modelos de concessão de créditos tradicionais, né? O que diferenciaria um projeto de geração distribuída de um project finance tradicional, em termos também não só de riscos, mas como de oportunidades de uma operação?
I'll start, but then Bill, feel free. I mean, typically the challenge for these financial institutions is that it falls between project finance, corporate finance, and leasing. So where exactly, or residential, commercial loans. So there's the projects tend to be, you want to finance them like project finance projects and just rely on the energy generated, but because they're so small, it's very difficult to make them project finance projects. Now in Brazil, we're talking about 5 megawatt projects that it does look much more like a project finance structure, and you can have all the legal and risk structures to finance those directly if it's a large 5 megawatt community solar type of project, the Geração remote projects we're talking about. But if we are talking about a typical consumer finance or residential loan, I think you can use the same. It helps to have investment officers that are educated on the product and specialize in the product to really do these types of loans. But I think you can use your traditional consumer finance products there. The tenor, if you want to pay back the project only with the savings, the tenor of the loan may have to be longer, and that's one of the big challenges. But the IFC also specializes in that, in longer tenor loans and in risk sharing to try to reduce those risks. I don't know if that was clear, but basically, a solar project financed is getting quicker and quicker, but typically a 5-year or 2-year loan is not going to be enough to pay back just with the savings. So you basically are operating a profit from day one. You put 0 down and you pay back just with the electricity savings. It can happen, but often you need a longer term loan to do that. If you want to put 0 down up front and you want to pay back just with the savings, you may need 8 to 10 year loan. It's getting faster in Brazil, though. I think we're probably at 5 to 6 years.
Ok. Em referência também à questão dos financiamentos, né? A gente viu que tanto as empresas de geração distribuída quanto os horários finais necessitam, né, de alguma escala de algum financiamento. Na visão de vocês, quais desses perfis seria mais arriscado do ponto de vista do credor e por quê?
Yeah. First, it depends on the structure, whether it's a rooftop on-site project, as Bill was explaining, or a remote generation project. That the other aspect is, of course, the collateral that you have. So I think that typically banks view that lending to a distributed generation company as higher risk, and they have less capital typically than lending, say, to a corporate who's borrowing on its own balance sheet. But the corporate on its own balance sheet may not be interested in using its capacity for that, and would prefer to finance it off their balance sheet with a distributed generation company. So a little bit depends on the willingness of your borrower to take that loan on their own balance sheet. or to provide guarantee. But these projects can be structured as low risk, even on a quasi project finance basis, given the energy is consistent, predictable. And again, in Brazil, you have credits, if you overproduce 1 year, you can use them for 5 years, so you can roll these credits. So it's a much less risky proposition than it appears.
Obrigada, Patrick. Acho que a gente está com um pequeno problema técnico do retorno, por isso que está um pouquinho com dificuldade para o Patrick falar. Não sei se já conseguimos resolver. Um minutinho. Um minutinho só para a gente se alinhar aqui, para não prejudicar os palestrantes nem os ouvintes aqui do webinar.
Yes, we can hear.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think it's fixed now. Apologies for the...
Não, obrigada pelo esforço da resposta. A gente percebeu que estava com alguma dificuldade. Mas acho que também deu para entender a mensagem. Obrigada, Patrick. Bem,
Did you want me to review that, or?
Eu não sei só como que só um minutinho, deixa eu só perguntar aqui como é que saiu para o pessoal que está ouvindo, se eles conseguiram ouvir a tradução. Só conseguir me confirmar aqui, por favor. Patrick, se você puder repetir novamente, só para a gente confirmar que a tradução foi para o canal certo.
Yes, Bill, do you want to add anything there, or continue, or kind of paraphrase what I said?
Why don't you go ahead and I'll add on at the end.
Obrigada.
Okay, so we were talking about whether it's more risky to lend to a project developer or DG company, or lend to a residential or commercial or industrial consumer. And obviously, as the financial institutions in attendance know, it depends a lot on the collateral and the type of project, whether it is on a roof or it's a remote project. And they each have their own risks. But I would say that because these projects basically pay for themselves, because they reduce costs, they tend to be lower risk loans than a typical loan for corporate expansion or a new business line. So even if you are lending to an SPV, if it's a project finance structure, the challenge then is to assess the credit risk sufficiently and have enough coverage or collateral that if you have some defaults, they will still be able to pay back the loan. And this is something that we've worked quite a bit with, and I know your institutions have a lot of expertise in. So I would say that overall, I would think it's a lower risk type of loan than other types of loans.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I would add on here is that in many markets, we see banks doing both. So, obviously the advantage of one of the advantages anyway, of lending to the distributed solar companies is that you don't have to identify individual projects or clients yourself. And if it's a good company, they're going to be very efficient at generating projects. These are relatively small loans that you're doing. So being able to do it through a distributed solar company is going to tend to be more efficient. And so the one example I would point to is a bank called UOB out of Singapore. They have a program called Use Solar operating in 4 or 5 countries now, and they're basically offering both. So they partner with a relatively small number of distributed solar companies, some of whom are financing the projects directly through the company, some of whom offer customers an opportunity to finance it themselves through UOB. But they use sort of a uniform or a single platform to do this. So basically, whatever the preference of the customer is and whatever the business model of the companies they want to work with is, they have a product available for them to fill that need. And then at the same time, they're also providing working capital and sort of other financing behind the scenes to the companies themselves. And that way they're allowing themselves to cover sort of the entire market. And so I think, as I said a little while ago, the key issue here is identifying companies you're comfortable working with. But if you can do that, there may be an opportunity to do both, really.
Ótimo, obrigada, Bill Patrick, pela repetição da resposta. Temos mais uma pergunta aqui que eu acho bem interessante, né, para a gente poder também ouvir bastante das experiências, né, que vocês têm, inclusive em outros mercados. Se vocês poderiam exemplificar alguns dos inputs do framework que a Ifc está desenvolvendo para auxiliar os bancos a avaliar os riscos técnicos dos portfólios de energia.
Yeah, I think this is a question about the inputs that go into the quality assurance framework that we've been developing.
Isso mesmo.
Yeah. And sorry, I'm hearing the translation again. But just could you confirm the question is about what inputs are going into the quality assurance framework that you might work with a bank to put in place?
Sim, vocês podem exemplificar dos inputs?
I think that's right, Bill. I think that's what they were referring to.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, so there's varying levels of complexity here, or you can get as simple or as complex as you want. But the sort of what we have done in other markets and what we're working on now is assessing the performance or the practices of solar companies kind of from beginning to end of the project. So that includes the procurement or the quality of the components they're using in their projects, panels, inverters, everything. It includes the process they use to design a project, and in particular, whether the individuals doing design and installation are trained and certified to a certain standard. It includes the practices they use in installation and in operations and maintenance of the project. And then potentially, if you have a company that has enough of a track record, you can also just look at the performance of their existing projects. So if there's data available on projects they've already installed, that can be the best indicator for you on quality assurance, because you have a healthy track record to look at. The challenge with many companies is because this is a relatively new market, they may not have that many projects that have been installed for several years and have been running for several years, and that we have a lot of data on. And in that case, you need to look at the components, you need to look at the training and certification of their staff, and you need to look at the practices they're following in design and installation and maintenance of projects.
Yeah, I would just say that the technical risks in solar tend to be much lower than other technologies. So, you have a small fraction of projects in general that have some problem with their installation. You generally have to assume a slightly less, a slightly lower amount of radiation or production than maybe was predicted initially, but the tools take that into account. A good solar developer won't oversell the customer and promise much more generation than they actually know can be realized. And in Brazil, the models have been accurate actually compared to some other parts of the world for what the expected production was over the last 5 to 10 years. So it all depends on how much sunlight you get, and of course if someone doesn't account for shading of the building next door or something like that. But I think overall the technical risks are much lower than in other types of projects.
Ótimo, Patrick, você já entrou um pouco na próxima pergunta, né, que é um pouco voltada nesse cenário de investimento, né, de geração distribuída para o mercado brasileiro, mas agora pensando um pouco mais para o futuro, né, no médio e longo prazo. E qual que seria o papel financeiro, do setor financeiro na contribuição da evolução desses cenários para um desenvolvimento que seja realmente sustentável e climaticamente resiliente para o papel do Brasil nos próximos anos? Como vocês veem esses cenários?
I'll say quick words, Bill, but feel free. I think really, I mean, providing that long-term and as low cost finance as possible is critical to these technologies continuing to be utilized, and banks really getting educated on the technology themselves. And when Brazil right now will still have very generous regulation in the future, but the next step will be, if I'm not injecting the excess energy into the grid and getting 100% credit for it, well, I can put a battery on in my own building, and then I'll store my own energy, and then I'll get 100% credit, right? So the battery technology, as it becomes economical, is really the next frontier that's going to make this market grow.
Yeah, I mean, as Patrick was saying earlier, we expect the Brazilian market to keep growing pretty rapidly, even with these regulatory changes. I think there's going to be healthy growth in the future. That said, I think probably the next 2 years are going to see really rapid growth. I mean, 2021 exceeded expectations. And I think 2022 and 2023 would also look to be very strong given the general state of the market in distributed solar and those regulatory changes. And so I would just say that there is sort of an immediate opportunity to be doing more in the space, and also a huge need in the market because there's going to be a lot of people wanting to install distributed solar, and that financing needs to come from somewhere. So just given the immediate sort of prospects of the market, I think I would say there's going to be a really big opportunity in the short term for financial institutions.
Yeah, I wanted to add one more thing, and that's unfortunate for Brazilians, but electricity prices have gone up almost 100% over the last 9 to 10 years, as you probably know, and it doesn't look like that's going to slow down. So despite you may be receiving 20 or 30% less compensation from the grid for energy that you inject. Now, energy you use yourself, you're still getting 100%, but energy you inject, well, if electricity prices still go up at 6% a year, that pretty soon is overwhelmed, as well as the capital costs coming down. So I would expect this is a market worth focusing on. It's going to continue to grow in Brazil.
Isso mesmo, Patrick, é a nossa expectativa realmente. Acho que também as instituições financeiras têm um papel muito importante aí neste cenário que vocês comentaram agora. A gente recebeu algumas outras perguntas que endereçaremos na próxima live, que, como a gente comentou, né, será um pouco mais focada no cenário brasileiro. e contaremos também com o suporte técnico e advice, né, da Ifc como nossa parceira aí, né, na elaboração desses conteúdos e da assessoria sobre a elaboração da assessoria sobre os temas que a gente está trabalhando aqui na série sobre finanças sustentáveis. Queria agradecer novamente a presença do Bill e do Patrick nesse webinar de hoje. Queria, né, abrir para últimos comentários, últimos pontos aqui antes da gente então finalizar.
No, I just really want to thank our partners at Febraban for setting this up, and it's a great pleasure to speak with you. And yeah, we hope we're all in person again soon.
Yes, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. And obviously, as we said, we're available if anyone has any further questions or would like to discuss this topic further. Please feel free to reach out.
Obrigada novamente. Queria agradecer também a Patrícia, nossa tradutora, todas as equipes da Febraban e da Ifc que estão aqui nos bastidores nos ajudando na organização dos eventos. E lembrando, né, que após a transmissão ao vivo, todos os webinars terão disponíveis a todos os interessados, com acesso gratuito e transmissão pela plataforma Numes, pelo canal do YouTube da Febraban. Nos próximos dias, os canais da Febraban e da Ifc anunciarão os próximos webinars temáticos e, como sempre, a gente contará com a participação de todos. Muito obrigada e nos vemos novamente em breve. Até mais.